The prairie was quiet that morning, so quiet that a man could hear the crunch of his own boots across the frost-bitten earth. The land stretched far and wide, flat and endless, the horizon kissed by a pale sky heavy with the promise of snow. Life out here was hard, and everyone knew it. It demanded grit, it demanded loss, and more than anything, it demanded sacrifice. That was the way of the West. Yet even in this harsh stillness, the story of two hearts would begin, one carved by grief and the other by shadows, colliding in a way neither could have foreseen. She stood in front of the weather-beaten cabin, her hands gripping the shawl around her shoulders as the wind clawed at her dress. The sheriff's widow. Folks in town whispered about her strength, how she never once cried when they lowered her husband into the ground, how she held her head high while the bells tolled. But strength had its cost. Behind her dark eyes lingered the weight of silence, a silence deeper than the prairie itself. She hadn't chosen this life of loneliness, yet here it was. Pressing against her like the icy air that crept under the boards of her home, the sheriff had been a hard man, stern and respected, but he was gone now, leaving her with little more than debts, a patch of stubborn land, and the wary glances of a town that pitied her yet kept its distance. Out here, a widow had few choices. Survival was not a gentle thing. It often came at the expense of pride. Soon she would discover that survival meant surrendering to an arrangement she never wanted. An arrangement that would bind her to a man just as broken as herself. He rode into town with the snow at his back, his figure tall in the saddle, his hat pulled low to hide eyes that carried storms. The brooding cowboy. He had a reputation that trailed behind him like dust from his horse's hooves. Some said he'd run from his past, others said his past had run him down. But all agreed on one truth: he carried a heaviness that no whiskey could drown. His words were few, his temper sharp, and yet there was a quiet fire in him, the kind that smoldered in the ashes of a soul scarred by life. No one dared to call him gentle, but there was something about him that unsettled even the hardest men. He was a reminder that pain does not disappear, only changes shape. When he dismounted that day, he wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble seemed to find him anyway. The townsfolk shifted uneasily, eyes darting between the cowboy and the widow. The law was gone with her husband, and lawlessness was a wolf forever prowling at the edge of town. The preacher spoke low, his voice carrying the weight of authority that the townsfolk craved. And before long, an arrangement was made. A forced union, born not of love but of necessity. He was to wed the sheriff's widow. She needed protection, and he, well, no one asked what he needed. The wedding was quiet, lacking celebration, but in the silence of that vow, there was an unspoken understanding. They were strangers bound together, two lives tethered not by choice but by circumstance. She avoided his gaze, her heart aching with memories of what she had lost. He stood beside her, his jaw set, his silence louder than any promise he might have made. It was not love, it was survival, and on the prairie, survival was the strongest vow of all. Yet the prairie had its secrets. Beneath the stillness, it watched, it waited, it tested. Days turned into weeks, and the cabin that had once been her prison now became their shared ground. She worked beside him, stubborn and unyielding, while he kept his distance, a wall of silence around him. But silence cannot last forever. One evening, as the sky bled into twilight, something shifted. The storm that had always lived inside him flickered, meeting the quiet ache within her. A touch, unplanned. A glance, unguarded. And then his first kiss. It was not soft, nor was it perfect. It was fierce, unsteady, born of hunger, neither dared admit. The taste of snow lingered on their lips, the world around them frozen in place. For the first time, the widow felt the stir of something she thought was buried with her husband. And for the first time, the cowboy felt the fire of belonging in a place he had always felt like a stranger. That kiss was not just a kiss. It was a spark on the silent prairie, a flame that refused to be smothered by grief or silence. But the prairie does not grant peace so easily. Beyond the rolling hills and white drifts, danger crept closer. Men who thrived in shadows, men who remembered debts unpaid and grudges unforgotten. The town whispered that the cowboy had enemies, the kind who would follow him to the ends of the earth. And now, with a widow by his side, he was no longer just a drifter. He was a husband, a protector, a target. She, too, carried her own secrets. Secrets that could break the fragile bond between them if ever brought to light. The wind howled outside the cabin. As he pulled back from the kiss, his breath heavy, his eyes searching hers for something neither could name. The prairie was alive with silence, yet beneath it pulsed the promise of storms. He knew it, she knew it. Their lives had changed with that single touch. The fire had been lit, and once lit, it could not be undone. But fire draws eyes, and eyes meant danger. The night deepened, and though the world outside seemed still, the ground beneath them was shifting. Somewhere in the distance, a horse cried out, the sound carried on the wind like a warning. Tomorrow would come with its share of trials, and survival would once again demand sacrifice. But for now, in that breathless moment, the sheriff's widow and the brooding cowboy stood on the edge of something neither could control, their fates bound by fire and silence. And just as quickly as it began, the moment broke. He stepped back, his hand falling to his side, his face a mask once more. She turned away, her heart racing, her breath unsteady. The kiss had awakened something they could not name, but the prairie would not let them linger in its warmth. Not yet, not while shadows waited beyond the horizon. The silent prairie had caught fire, and there was no telling what would burn first: the land, their hearts, or the fragile vow that bound them together. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. She stood near the table, her hands resting against its rough surface, her breath shallow as if she feared even the still air might betray her racing heart. The cowboy had turned away after that kiss, silent once more, yet she could still feel the press of his lips, the unspoken promise lingering like the faint smoke in the room. He was a man who carried storms in his eyes, and she knew enough of storms to recognize they did not pass easily. She should have been afraid, and part of her was. But beneath the unease was something more dangerous. Hope, a fragile ember that could burn her alive if she let it. He leaned against the doorframe, his broad shoulders outlined against the dim light, his silence stretching between them like a rope pulled too tight. For all his brooding distance, there was something about the way he watched her, as if every moment was a test he dared not fail. She wanted to ask what haunted him, why his gaze always lingered on the horizon as though he expected the past to ride over it at any moment. But she held her tongue. Out here, words were a kind of currency, and he did not spend his easily. The town was not kind to her since the sheriff's death. The people respected her, perhaps even pitied her, but their whispers carried through thin walls and across narrow streets. They spoke of her debts, of her husband's enemies, of her unyielding pride. Now, with the cowboy at her side, their whispers grew sharper. Some saw him as a protector, others as a drifter with too much darkness to bring into her home. Yet the preacher had said the vows, and vows carried weight on the prairie. She was his wife now, whether her heart was ready or not. And he was her husband, though no one could say whether the word meant comfort or danger. As winter pressed down harder, the days blurred into one another. Snow fell in heavy drifts, blanketing the land, muffling the sound of life until all that remained was the sharp wind and the creak of the cabin's timbers. She learned his rhythms, the way he rose before dawn, his boots heavy on the floorboards as he readied the horse for the day's labor. She watched the way his hands moved, rough but steady, the hands of a man who had worked the land, fought for survival, and perhaps carried sins no prayer could wash away. He asked for little, yet in the silence she felt his presence fill every corner of the cabin at night. When the world outside grew darker than pitch, she lay awake listening to the wind rattle against the windows. Sleep did not come easy. Her thoughts returned to the sheriff, to the life she had once believed was secure, to the sudden violence that had left her alone. There were questions that gnawed at her, questions the town rarely asked aloud. Why had her husband been shot? Who had fired the bullet? The sheriff was not a man without enemies, and justice was not always served by the law. Sometimes it was settled by shadows at the edge of town, by men who believed a gun spoke louder than a badge. She wondered if the cowboy knew more than he let on. He carried himself with a guarded knowledge, as though he had seen too many endings to trust in beginnings. She saw it in the way his hand never strayed far from his holster, the way his gaze swept every room before he stepped inside. He was a man expecting trouble, and she feared that by standing beside him, trouble would find her too. Yet there was no denying the strange safety she felt when he was near, the way the walls of the cabin seemed less thin, the prairie less cruel when his shadow stretched beside hers. The townsfolk kept their distance, though some dared to test him. A pair of ranch hands, full of whiskey and spite, cornered him outside the saloon one night, their words sharp with challenge. She heard the tale whispered the next morning at the mercantile, how he had not drawn first, how he had stood calm as the men spat their insults, how his silence broke only when the first hand reached for his belt. They said he moved quicker than sight itself, his gun drawn before the other man even touched his steel. No shots were fired. He didn't need to. His stare alone sent them stumbling into the snow, their bravado bleeding out into the night air. By the time she heard it, the story had grown, but she knew enough to believe the heart of it. He was not a man to be cornered, not a man to be underestimated. And now he was hers, for better or worse. Still, questions lingered. He spoke little of his past, but pieces slipped through like cracks in an old fence. A name muttered in his sleep. A scar along his shoulder that looked less like accident and more like survival. Once she found him staring into the fire, his expression carved from stone, his lips forming words she couldn't hear. When she asked if he was all right, he simply nodded, his jaw tightening as though holding back an entire world. She did not press him further, though her heart longed to know. What ghosts did he carry? What debts did he owe? And when those debts came calling, would they come for her too? The kiss they shared that winter evening haunted her. It lingered in her mind with every stolen glance, every accidental brush of his hand against hers as they worked side by side. It was dangerous, that kiss, because it stirred something she had long buried. It reminded her that she was still alive, that her heart still beat, even though grief had tried to silence it. Yet she also feared it. Affection was a weakness out here, a weakness that could be torn away in an instant. Love was not a safe thing. Love was a risk, and risks had a way of leaving scars. One evening, as the snow thickened and the sky turned to steel, she ventured into town with him. The streets were quiet, but whispers followed them. At the general store, the shopkeeper lowered his gaze, speaking in clipped tones. Outside the blacksmith's, a pair of men leaned against the wall, their eyes sharp, their murmurs low. She felt it in her bones, the unease, the suspicion, the weight of eyes that did not trust. And she wondered if it was truly her they judged, or the man at her side. Either way, it was clear. Their lives together would not be allowed peace. Not while the prairie remembered old grudges that night. After they returned to the cabin, she found herself unable to hold the questions back any longer. She asked him where he had come from, what he had left behind. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes dark, his silence heavy. Then he said only one thing: "Some places don't let go." It was not an answer, yet it was more than she had expected. His past was a locked door, and she was not sure if she wanted to know what waited behind it. But as the fire cracked, the hearth, and the wind pressed against the cabin walls, she felt the truth settling in her chest. Trouble was coming. It was not a matter of if, but when. She could sense it in the way he lingered outside at night, scanning the horizon. She could hear it in the restless cry of distant coyotes, the way the horses shifted uneasily in the dark. The prairie was holding its breath, and so was she. When sleep finally came, it was uneasy. She dreamt of shadows moving across the land, of riders approaching with torches that lit the sky red. She dreamt of his hand reaching for hers, only for both of them to be pulled apart by the wind. She woke with a start, her chest heaving, the cold air sharp against her skin. Beside her, he sat awake, staring out the window, his expression grim. He did not tell her what he saw in the darkness. He did not have to. The look in his eyes was enough. The silent prairie had caught fire. And though the flames had not yet reached their cabin, they were coming. Somewhere beyond the snow and the hills, men were moving. Men who carried grudges like weapons, Men who had not forgotten the cowboy, or the sheriff, or the land that both had tried to claim. And when they arrived, the widow knew her life would change again. As swiftly and as brutally as it had before, the fire burned lower still, and the wind howled louder, and in that moment, she realized something she had not dared to admit before. It was not just his enemies she feared. It was her own heart. Because the kiss had been a beginning, and beginnings had a way of demanding endings. And out here on the prairie, endings rarely came gentle. Snow melted slow that spring, leaving the prairie damp and restless, as if the earth itself was waiting for something to break loose. The widow could feel it in the air, in the way the days stretched longer, yet never seemed to bring peace. The cowboy had grown more watchful, his eyes sharper, his hands steady on the reins whenever they rode into town. He said little, but silence did not fool her anymore. Silence was his way of holding back the storm inside him. She could sense it growing louder with every passing week. Word traveled fast in small towns, carried on hushed voices and the rattle of wagon wheels. Whispers of riders seen near the ridge. Strangers at the saloon asking about the widow and the man she had married. No one spoke their names outright, but she knew those whispers pointed back to him. His past was no longer something he could outrun. It was riding toward them, steady as the wind that swept the prairie clean of sound. She tried to keep the cabin running as she had before, chopping wood, tending the small garden, mending clothes until her fingers ached. Yet it was different now. She was no longer alone, and the rhythm of her days was tangled with his. She found herself glancing at the door when he left at dawn, her chest tightening until she saw him ride back at dusk. And every time he returned, dust on his boots and that unreadable look in his eyes. She wondered if one day he might not come back at all. The preacher came to visit one evening, his coat heavy with road dust, his Bible tucked under his arm. He spoke kindly, but there was steel in his words. The town needed order, he said. The sheriff was gone, and though the widow was strong, the prairie was no place for a woman to stand alone. The people needed reassurance. They needed someone to keep the law alive, someone who could hold back the lawless men who thrived on fear. His eyes flicked toward the cowboy as he spoke, and though he did not say it outright, the meaning was clear. The town wanted him to step into the sheriff's place. The widow's heart tightened at the thought. Her husband had worn that badge, and it had killed him. She could still hear the crack of the gun that ended it, still see the way the town gathered at his grave in silence. She did not want that fate for another man, least of all the one she had been bound to. But the cowboy only listened, his face unreadable. And when the preacher left, he stood at the window for a long while, staring at the fading horizon. The conflict grew not just with the town, but within her too. She wanted to protect him from the weight of the badge, from the danger that came with standing as law in a land where law was more idea than truth. Yet part of her knew that he was already a marked man with or without it. The past would find him, and perhaps the badge would not change that, but only hasten it. Still, fear clawed at her. She had buried one husband, and the earth had not yet forgotten the weight of that loss. In town, the tension sharpened. Supplies grew short, and fights broke out in the saloon more often than not. A rancher claimed his cattle were being stolen, while another swore his land was being watched by strangers at night. Every rumor fed the fire. The widow began to notice the way the townsfolk looked at her, not with pity now, but with suspicion. Some believed she had brought trouble with her new marriage. Others whispered that her husband's death was no accident, that enemies old and new had their eyes on her land. She could not escape the feeling that the cabin itself was being watched. At night, she heard distant hoofbeats across the prairie, sounds that faded too quickly to belong to wandering riders. Once, she thought she saw a flicker of fire near the ridge, but by morning there was nothing but ash and silence. She told him what she saw, but he only nodded, his jaw tight, as if he had already expected it. The subplots began to weave themselves into their days, each thread tugging at the fragile bond they had begun to build. A young boy from town, father gone and mother too sick to work, began lingering near the cabin, drawn by the promise of food and the quiet strength of the cowboy. She took pity on him, giving him bread when he came by. but she worried what it meant to invite another soul into their lives when they were already carrying so much weight. The boy looked at the cowboy as if he were some kind of hero, and though the man never said it aloud, she saw the flicker of something soften in his eyes each time the child returned. Yet even that tenderness was a danger. Attachment was a weakness in a land that swallowed the weak whole. She feared the boy's presence might draw attention, that those who hunted her husband would not spare a child if it came to it. Still, she could not bring herself to turn him away, perhaps because she saw herself in him alone, desperate, waiting for someone to stand beside him when the prairie turned cruel. The cowboy, for his part, grew more restless. He began to ride further each day, scouting the land with a sharp eye, returning with little more than a shake of his head. She asked him once what he was looking for, and he replied only, "Signs." When she pressed him, he did not answer, and she let the question hang between them like smoke in the air at night. When he thought she was asleep, she heard him outside, pacing the yard, the crunch of his boots steady against the frozen ground. Once, she saw him kneel by the horse, his hand resting against its flank, his head bowed as if in prayer. She realized then that his silence was not emptiness, but burden. He carried more than she could see, and every mile of his past was etched into the way he stood, the way he moved, the way he guarded her without ever saying why. The real conflict pressed closer one night when riders came through town. Strangers, lean and hard-eyed, their words sharp, their laughter cruel. They bought whiskey, asked too many questions, left tracks in the mud that the rain could not wash away. Folks whispered that they were looking for someone. No one dared say who, but she knew. She felt it in her bones, in the way her husband's badge still gleamed faintly in the drawer, in the way the cowboy's hand twitched toward his gun when the strangers' names were mentioned. The town braced itself. The prairie held its breath, and in the quiet cabin, on the edge of it all, the widow and the cowboy lived between moments. She tried to cling to the rhythm of daily work, to find solace in the ordinary tasks of survival. But every sound beyond the window set her heart racing. He grew sharper, his silence heavier, his presence both a comfort and a reminder of the danger closing in. The kiss they had shared still burned in her memory, a spark that refused to fade. Yet it was not comfort anymore, it was warning. That spark could grow into a fire too strong to control, and in a land built on violence and survival, fire was never safe. She wanted to believe in the promise of it, in the fragile warmth they had begun to build. But each day reminded her that warmth was temporary. Out here, storms always came, and when they did, they tore everything down to the roots. The prairie stretched silent beyond the walls, but silence did not mean peace. Silence meant waiting, and she knew they would not wait long. The prairie was restless, shifting under the weight of a storm that had not yet broken. Days grew heavy with a silence too sharp to be natural, the kind of silence that made even the birds scarce and set the dogs to howling at nothing. The widow felt it every time she stepped out of the cabin, her breath clouding in the cool air, her eyes searching the horizon as if it might finally give away its secrets. Somewhere out there, men were moving closer. She didn't know how many, didn't know when they would strike, but she could sense it. The way one senses a rattler in the grass before it makes a sound, the cowboy grew leaner with the waiting. His jaw was always set, his hand never far from his revolver, his gaze sweeping the land as though trying to read what could not be read. At night, she watched him from the corner of her eye as he sat near the fire, the glow of the flames cutting across the lines of his face. He never spoke of fear, never spoke of doubt, but she could see the weight he carried. It was in the way his shoulders hunched slightly when he thought no one was looking, in the way he stood too long at the window. His shadow stretched against the wall like a man bracing for a fight he could not avoid. The strangers in town had not gone. They lingered like wolves circling a campfire, close enough to be seen but far enough to strike when least expected. The widow heard the stories from neighbors who came with nervous smiles and eyes that darted toward the ground. The men asked about her, about the cabin, about the cowboy. They asked about the sheriff too, and though her husband had been gone months now, it was as though his death had only opened a wider door for trouble. Folks warned her to keep close to home, to mind her business, but it was no use. Trouble had already chosen her home. Even the boy who came to the cabin began to notice the change. He lingered less at the doorway, his laughter gone, his eyes wide as he whispered that the strangers had taken to watching him when he walked near the ridge. She pressed bread into his hands and told him to stay close to his mother. But her heart ached knowing a child had been pulled into shadows meant for grown men. The cowboy said nothing when she told him, only saddled his horse and rode off into the fading light. He returned hours later, silent, but the look in his eyes told her enough. He had seen them. The town itself seemed split in two. Some wanted the cowboy to step forward, to take up the badge and bring order back before lawlessness swallowed them whole. Others feared that if he did, the men hunting him would turn their guns on everyone. Tension coiled tighter each day, stretching across the streets, seeping into the saloon, the church, even the mercantile. Neighbors stopped lingering to talk. Doors closed earlier at night. The widow could feel the whole town holding its breath, waiting for the match to strike. Her own nights grew longer. She dreamed of hoofbeats thundering closer, of fire lighting up the prairie grass, of shadows breaking down the cabin door. Each morning she woke with her heart racing, only to find him already awake. Sitting near the window, his gun resting across his knee, she wanted to ask him if the dreams were more than dreams, if he sensed them too, but she kept her words to herself. She feared if she spoke them aloud, they might take shape. One evening, as the last of the sun bled across the sky, they stood together outside the cabin. The prairie stretched endless before them, the grass whispering low in the wind. He stood still, his hat pulled low, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance. She followed his gaze but saw nothing, only the shimmer of heat above the earth. Then he spoke, his voice low, steady, but sharp as steel. "They're closer than before." Her stomach twisted at the words, though she had known them in her bones already. She asked how many, and he shook his head. Enough. That night, he set about checking the cabin, his movements calm but deliberate. He stacked wood near the door, filled buckets with water, checked the windows and the lock on the back. She watched him in silence, her chest tight. It struck her then that he was not only preparing for a fight, he was preparing for a siege. Whatever was coming would not be a passing danger. It would be something meant to break them. The widow tried to keep her hands busy, mending shirts, sweeping the floor, anything to chase away the fear clawing at her ribs. Yet every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the walls, sent her heart leaping. She thought back to the day she first laid eyes on him, as a stranger who carried storms in his silence, and she realized how little she truly knew of him. But she knew enough. He was not a man who ran. And because of that, neither could she. The next morning, a note was nailed to the church door. No one knew who put it there, but everyone read it. The words were short, cut deep as a knife. Leave the cowboy, or the town would burn. Whispers turned to arguments, arguments to shouting. Some demanded she cast him out, said she owed the town that much after all the danger he had brought to their doorstep. Others said turning him away would only make enemies of men already waiting to kill him. She stood in the middle of it, her shawl pulled tight, her heart pounding as faces pressed close, their words heavy with desperation. Yet when she looked at the cowboy, he did not flinch. He stood apart, his hat low, his silence louder than the shouting. And in that silence, she found her answer. She would not leave him, not now, not ever. The days that followed pressed harder. Strangers were seen on the ridge at night, their campfires flickering against the hills like watching eyes. Cattle were found dead, their hides slashed, a warning carved in silence. The preacher prayed louder. The blacksmith kept his gun near. The saloon stayed open longer, its doors swinging with restless men. And in the cabin, the widow and the cowboy waited, the space between them heavy with the knowledge that time was running out. One night, the boy returned, his face pale, his eyes wide. He whispered that he had seen the strangers closer than before, near the river where the town drew water. He said they carried rifles, that they spoke of fire. She pulled him inside, her hands trembling, her heart thudding against her ribs. The cowboy crouched before the boy, his voice low and calm, asking every detail, every word. When the boy left, The widow saw it in his eyes. The storm had arrived. That evening, he saddled the horse and handed her the rifle her husband once carried. "Stay inside," he told her, his tone sharp but not unkind. "If they come, you fire first. Don't wait." She wanted to argue, to tell him she would not be left behind, but the words stuck in her throat. The weight of the rifle in her hands was answer enough. She watched him ride off into the dusk, the sound of hooves fading into the endless prairie. And for the first time since she had married him, she feared she might never see him return. The night stretched long. The wind sharp against the windows, the fire crackling low. Every sound outside made her tighten her grip on the rifle. Every shadow against the walls made her heart race. Hours passed with no sign of him, until at last she heard it hoofbeats. Fast, hard, not one horse but many. The sound rolled across the land like thunder, closer and closer until it seemed the earth itself was shaking beneath her feet. She ran to the window, her breath catching as she saw them at last. Riders dark against the moonlit sky, their torches high, their shouts carried on the wind. And at their front she thought she saw him, his figure tall in the saddle, his gun raised, firelight flickering across his face. But whether he was leading them or fighting them, she could not tell. The prairie roared alive with sound, the silence shattered. The storm breaking at last. Her hands tightened on the rifle, her chest burning, her eyes fixed on the door. The climax had come, and everything her past, her survival. Her fragile hope hung in the balance. The thunder of hooves shook the ground as the riders closed in, their torches blazing against the night sky. The widow pressed her back to the cabin wall, the rifle clutched in her hands, her breath sharp and uneven. She could hear the shouting now, voices rough with rage, words carried by the wind. The moment she had feared for so long had finally arrived. Every shadow, every whisper, every restless night had led to this. And now there was no turning away. Through the window, she caught sight of the cowboy. His figure cut through the chaos, tall in the saddle, steady as stone even with fire all around him. His gun was drawn, flashing bright as it caught the torchlight. He rode straight into the storm of men, his presence commanding, his voice ringing out against theirs. She could not hear the words, but she saw the effect. The riders split, some pulling back in hesitation, others surging forward with fury. He was one man against many, yet he did not falter. It was as if he had been waiting for this all along. The first shots cracked across the prairie, sharp and final. The widow flinched but forced herself to hold steady, the rifle raised, her eyes fixed on the door. She knew it was only a matter of time before the fight reached the cabin. The boy's frightened face flashed in her mind. The preacher's warning words, the townsfolk torn between fear and loyalty, everything balanced on this one night. She could feel it burning into her soul. When the door rattled, her heart nearly burst. A shadow fell across the frame. The sound of boots thudding heavy on the porch. She gripped the rifle tighter, her finger trembling against the trigger. Then a voice came low and urgent. His voice. She rushed forward, throwing the latch aside, and pulled him in. His chest heaved with the effort of the fight, sweat streaking his face, a cut above his brow bleeding into the dust. But his eyes were steady, and they locked onto hers with a clarity that burned through the fear. "They won't stop," he said, his voice hoarse but certain. "They came for me, but they'll burn it all if they have to." Her hands shook, but she steadied them. "Then we fight," she said, surprising even herself with the strength in her words. He studied her for a heartbeat, then nodded. No more arguments, no more silence. They were in this together. The night raged on outside. The townsfolk, hearing the gunfire, began to gather. First a few, then more. Men with rifles, women with lanterns, children pulled back into doorways, as voices rose above the chaos. The preacher stood tall in the street, calling for order, his voice fierce in a way few had ever heard before. The town that had been divided now found itself forced into unity. Whatever grudges lingered, whatever doubts had festered, they all burned away in the fire of survival. The riders pressed hard, but the cowboy met them with every ounce of grit he had. At his side, the widow fired from the cabin window, her shots steady, her fear transformed into resolve. Every bullet carried more than survival, it carried defiance, a refusal to be broken by shadows. She thought of her late husband, of the badge he had worn, of the silence that had followed his death. For the first time, she understood that the prairie did not need men who wore badges. It needed people willing to stand for one another, no matter the cost. The fight stretched into what felt like forever. The air thick with smoke, the ground torn by hoofbeats and fire. But little by little, the riders began to break. Their confidence faltered against the steady wall of resistance, their torches snuffed out one by one. Some fled into the darkness, their curses fading with the wind. Others fell silent where they stood, the prairie taking back what it always demanded. And when the last of them finally rode off, leaving only the echo of their retreat, the land fell still once more. The widow lowered her rifle, her arms heavy, her breath ragged. Her eyes searched for him, for the cowboy who had fought like a man with nothing left to lose. He stood outside the cabin, shoulders slumped, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. When she stepped toward him, he turned, his eyes meeting hers. And in them she saw not just the storm, but the calm that followed. The townsfolk gathered around, their faces pale with shock, but lit with something else too. Relief, gratitude, a quiet recognition that the fight had changed them. They were no longer a town divided by whispers and fear. They had stood together, and in doing so, they had become stronger. The preacher raised his voice, calling it a victory, but the widow knew better. It was not victory. It was survival. And survival was all the prairie ever promised. In the days that followed, the town rebuilt. Burned fences were mended, doors repaired, graves dug where they were needed. Life returned, though it carried the scars of the night. The widow moved through it with steady steps, her shawl wrapped tight, her heart heavy, yet strangely lighter than before. She knew loss, but she also knew the strength that had risen in its place. She had seen herself not as a woman left behind, but as one who had stood her ground when it mattered most. The cowboy did not leave. For a while, she wondered if he might. He was a man built for drifting, for carrying his storms from one horizon to the next. But he stayed, his silence no longer a wall, but a space she had learned to understand. He worked beside her, repaired the cabin, tended the land. And though he still carried shadows in his eyes, they were not as dark as before. He had found something worth staying for. And she could feel it every time his gaze lingered on her a moment longer than it needed to. The boy who had once come hungry and afraid now smiled when he passed the cabin. His steps lighter, his shoulders straighter. He carried the memory of that night too, but he carried it as proof that not all battles ended in loss. The town welcomed him, the preacher guiding him, the blacksmith giving him work. In the way he looked up to the cowboy, the widow saw a new story being written, one that carried hope instead of fear. When spring turned to summer, the prairie came alive again. The grass grew tall, the river swelled with clear water, the air filled with the sound of birds returning. The widow stood on the porch one morning, the sun warm on her face, and let herself breathe deep. The land was still harsh, still unforgiving, but it no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like something she had earned, something she had claimed through blood and fire. The cowboy joined her, his hand brushing against hers, his silence filled not with distance but with quiet belonging. She thought of the first time they had kissed, of the way it had set the silent prairie aflame. That fire had nearly destroyed them, but it had also lit the path forward. It had shown her that even in the harshest places, hearts could still burn bright. She did not know what the future would bring. The prairie never promised certainty, only struggle and survival. But she knew this much. She was no longer the sheriff's widow, bound by grief and silence. She was a woman who had stood through the storm, who had chosen not to break, who had found something worth holding on to in the midst of it all. And the cowboy, once a man chased by his past, had found his place beside her, not as a drifter, not as a shadow, but as a partner. Their story was carved into the land now, written not in words, but in the way they stood together, side by side, against whatever the prairie sent their way as the wind swept across the tall grass. carrying with it the scent of earth and the promise of tomorrow. She leaned into him, her voice low but steady. "We're still here," he nodded, his arms steady around her shoulders, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "And we'll stay." The prairie was silent again, but this time it was not the silence of waiting or fear. It was the silence of peace hard-earned, the kind that lingers after fire has passed and new life begins to grow. And in that silence, the widow and the cowboy stood together, knowing that whatever storms might come, they had already lit the prairie once, and they could do it again.